Please join me in the prayer of illumination. God of mercy, in the midst of our daily lives, speak now your eternal word to us, so that we may respond to your gracious promises with faithfulness, service, and love. Amen. Our first reading is from Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 36. Jesus and his disciples came to a place called Gethsemane. Jesus said to them, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him. He began to feel despair and was anxious, and he said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Stay here and keep alert." Then he went a short distance farther and fell to the ground. He prayed that, if possible, he might be spared the time of suffering. He said, "Abba, Father, for all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want."
Before I begin, I do want to thank the choir for their rousing rendition there for our choral piece. And I do want to mention that Jumi is away at a conference, and thank Joe Lim for both accompanying and leading the choir today. Obviously, they've done a great job, so thank you very much. So this week we continue on in our narrative lectionary, and we continue for the third week in a row to read from the book of Genesis. This morning, though, we're going to jump ahead one generation. If you were here last week when Mary Nagley was preaching, we heard that story about Sarah and Abraham and the promise of a child of another generation. And we know of that miraculous birth of Isaac, called the son of laughter. Now, the story continues. Isaac has grown up and he's married a woman named Rebekah. And they have had two twin sons, Esau and Jacob. In your bulletin this morning, there was an insert, if you want to take a brief look at that. Don't worry, we're not going to have a quiz on it or anything. This gives you a sense of the genealogy that goes on throughout, really, both the book of Genesis and then throughout the rest of the Old Testament as well. So on the bottom right there, you see the little dotted box. That's Jacob, who we're going to be talking about this morning. And you can see above Isaac and Rebekah, Esau next to him, who becomes the father of the nation of Edom. And then from Jacob, as we'll hear, he is renamed Israel. And from Jacob comes the 12 tribes of Israel. So that just gives you a little background. I'm not going to refer to it again, but I thought it was helpful. Things can get a little confusing with these family histories. So this morning, as we read the story of Jacob, it helps to have a little bit of background. Now remember, Esau was the older brother, and that means he is deserving of the birthright from his father because he is the oldest. He is the heir. The younger brother, Jacob, though, we see soon tricks his brother out of his father's blessing, and he receives the birthright. Esau, not surprisingly, is not very happy when he figures this out. And so Jacob ends up fleeing into exile because Esau has threatened to kill him as revenge. Jacob goes north and he ends up marrying two different women, two sons of a man named Laban, who is his uncle. He has many children. He brings some significant wealth in his years away. But then he gets into trouble again. Jacob is a bit of a trickster and a manipulator and often finds himself in difficult situations. And so he decides now that he is going to return back home. It's been almost 20 years now since he has run away, but he has a vision from God calling him back home to the place that he has left so long ago. But as he comes to return home, he hears news that his brother Esau knows he is on the way. And Esau has 400 soldiers with him coming out to meet Jacob. And so the news fills Jacob with terror. He's worried that his brother is indeed going to kill him. And so he prays for the Lord at the beginning of this chapter 32 for protection. He reminds the Lord of the promises that Jacob will have many descendants. And then we come to the scene that we read from today. Jacob is on the banks of the river Jabbok, and he's about to split his family up into two as a way of protecting his family and his wealth. Behind him are his past, the many deceptions and the lies and the difficulty that he's been in. Ahead of him is this brother who he has cheated out of his inheritance, who is most likely angry with him. So let's find out what happens next. I'm reading from Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the Jabbok River's shallow waters. He took them and everything he belonged, and he helped them to cross the river. But Jacob himself stayed apart. And while he was apart and alone, a man wrestled with him in the dark until the dawn finally broke. And when this man saw that he could not defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and he tore a muscle there as he wrestled with him. The man said, "Let me go, because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so he said to Jacob, "What is your name?" And he replied, "Jacob." And then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but you will now be called Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men, and you have won." And then Jacob asked, "What is your name?" But the man said, "Why do you ask my name?" And so he blessed Jacob there. And Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen here God face to face, he said, and my life has been saved. The sun rose and Jacob passed from Peniel. He was limping because of the injury to his thigh. And therefore Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the thigh muscle to this day, because he grabbed Jacob's thigh at the tendon. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In 1940, the novel You Can't Go Home Again by Thomas Wolfe was published. And it was actually 2 years after the author's death. It tells the story of a man named George Weber, and it begins just before the great stock market crash in 1929. As the story begins, Weber decides to move from his hometown in North Carolina, and he relocates to New York City, and there he begins to write his first novel. Now, the folks back home were quite thrilled to hear about this novel, because it was about his life back in his hometown. They were thrilled, that is, until they actually got a copy and read the book. And now they were angry. They were angry because the descriptions of his hometown and the people were not very flattering. In fact, it made fun of their faults and their mannerisms and cast them in a very difficult and unflattering way. Some people began to write nasty letters to George, and they would make phone calls at night to him, ranging from polite scoldings to actual death threats, because what have they read about themselves in this book? Family and lifelong friends of George Weber feel embarrassed because of the words and descriptions. And it's so bad that their fury and their anger drives George Weber away from his home. As an outcast, he begins to look for his own identity now that he has been sent into exile. The journey, as you read in the novel, takes him not just to New York City, but also to Paris and to Berlin. And it finally comes full circle when he returns back home to America. And he rediscovers himself, but he also finds sorrow in love and hope. Near the end of the novel, George says this. He says, "You can't go back home to your family, back home to your childhood, back home to a young man's dreams of glory and of fame. You can't go back home to the father you have lost and have been looking for, back home to someone who can't help you, to save you or ease your burdens. You can't go back home to the old forms and the old systems of things. Once they seemed so everlasting, but now times are changing. Back home to the escapes of time and memory." Now, that phrase, of course, "you can't go back home again," has entered our common vocabulary. And in many ways, it has taken on a life far beyond Thomas Wolfe's novel. Some people use it to mean they can't return to the perhaps small-town roots where they grew up, now that they've traveled and seen a larger world. For others, it means we can't return to the glory days of youth, when life seemed so simple and happy. For other people, though, I think it means that they can't return to a God that they once loved and believed in because they see so many failures and mistakes along the way. They seem too lost and simply cannot make it back home. Now, as we turn to the story of Jacob this morning, we see that he too is in the midst of a journey back home. And as we read this story, it should be very clear to us that Jacob is not a hero. Jacob is not a paragon of virtue. He's not a model of behavior for us to follow. In fact, from the day of his birth, Jacob has been a trickster and a schemer. He's been grabbing and scrambling to get his own way in the world. And now, 20 years later, after he has left home, he finds that he begins to face the consequences, that a day of reckoning is coming to him after such a long period of time. And I think in many ways this story captures us as it has captured generations because it calls us back into that deep human desire to return back home to our roots, back to the way things used to be, to simpler times. And of course, we have a word for that, and that word is nostalgia, that sentimental yearning for the way things used to be, when it seems simpler and better in the past. It's interesting, if you look up the word nostalgia and find the word origins, it comes from two Greek words. The first word means homecoming or returning, and the second part of the word means pain or ache. So it is the ache of returning, that desire to be back home. But of course, the situation here is much more complex and dangerous for Jacob. This is not just some innocent family reunion that he's going back to or a gathering of old friends. In fact, this is a life and death situation. Jacob is preparing to face his estranged brother Esau. Esau, who he defrauded and swindled out of his rightful birthright. Esau, who is now coming out to meet him with an army of 400 soldiers. And so it's under these circumstances that we have this interesting and mysterious wrestling out in the wilderness between Jacob and this mysterious being, this man, this creature who shows up there to wrestle with him. Now, exactly who is this mysterious figure we want to know? Is it a dream, or is it somehow Esau who has come under the cover of darkness? Is it Jacob's past he is wrestling with? Or maybe it is God himself who is there with him. Well, the question of who this character is has been debated for thousands of years. And frankly, we are not quite sure exactly who it is. But I think we get a good clue in verse 28, because the mysterious figure says, "You will no longer be called Jacob, but rather you will be called Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men in one. And of course, in response, Jacob names the place where the wrestling happens Peniel, because he says, I have seen God face to face and my life has been saved. To Jacob then, he wrestles with the God of Abraham and Isaac out there. That's who he understands this figure to be as he's in the darkness on the riverside. But as we see, God here does not come as some sweet and forgiving presence, but rather under the cloak of darkness, God comes as this mysterious adversary, appearing out of nowhere and physically wrestling with Jacob throughout the night. Now, as we heard, the struggle is lengthy. It lasts until dawn, and it is inconclusive. But Jacob is determined. He hangs on for dear life. He refuses to let go until he receives a blessing. And the blessing that he receives is a new name, literally a new identity, Israel, the one who strives and wrestles with God. And so the new name remembers this struggle that he has out there in the darkness. And it leaves, of course, him limping and physically injured because of what he has wrestled with, a reminder of this face-to-face encounter with God. And so why do we read this story thousands of years later? Why is it still important to us? Well, I think in many ways it is a model for what faith can often be like. It is not neat and easy to understand. And in fact, this act of grappling with God can somehow help us to fit things together when life seems confusing and difficult. The character of God and the character of Jacob are both remarkably revealed in this passage this morning. We notice that God does not punish Jacob for his tarnished character, for the bad behavior throughout his life that he has exhibited. But instead, God challenges and reshapes and transforms Jacob into a new person. And so the story challenges our desire to domesticate God, to make this God fit into some easy and simple mold, but rather a God who is willing to wrestle with us. Jacob comes away from the encounter this morning with immeasurable blessings. He also is physically marked, though, as he is limping and no longer able to move as he was previously. As a result, Jacob invites us to live into this new life, and he himself has a new future as he has a new name, the one who strives with God. I think in many ways this Jacob story is a much-needed reminder that the life of faith, that there is never one ideal that we find, that God is willing to entertain all kinds of different characters and personalities, even those who we may find difficult to deal with by our own standards. The late Eugene Peterson has this comment about this story. He says, Jacob exhibits here what we might call a holy life. And that is not a matter of men and women being polite with God, but rather of humans who accept and enter into God's work of shaping them out of the unlikely materials of life. God is willing to shape us out of our sin and our ignorance, out of our ambition and our waywardness. But God also shapes us from our loves and our aspirations and our nobilities. God never smooths over the rough edges of life. And so being holy is not about being polished and elegant, but rather about being real with God. I think we also tell this story again and again because it is a story of new hope and new life, of blessings that come out of brokenness and injury that bring about new community and new hope. Joan Chittister has a whole book based on this wrestling of Jacob. It's a book called Scarred by Struggle and Transformed by Hope. And near the end of the book, she has this summary. She said, Jacob does what all of us must do if, in the end, we too are to become true to God. Jacob confronts in himself the things that are wounding him. He admits his limitations, he accepts his situation, he rejoins the world, and he moves on to a new future. The result of Jacob's struggle and through the night is a blessing that God has given him. Jacob is wounded but blessed, scarred but surrounded by God's grace. We read this story finally because we too are the spiritual descendants of Jacob. We too are people who wrestle with God. And the God whom we wrestle with is one who is willing to come and meet us in the midst of the difficult realities of our human lives. We see it here in Genesis 32, and we also see it in the life and the ministry of Jesus. And that story that Meg just shared with us as Jesus is near the end of his life, struggling with his own faith, we see the same wrestling happen as it can happen in our lives. One last story to finish. The story is told about a young rabbinic student who asked his rabbi, his master, his teacher, and said, Master, is the story of Jacob wrestling with God by the river Jabbok true? Well, the old rabbi put his hand on the young one's shoulder and he said, Of course it's true. It happens to me all the time. And so, friends, we read this story because ultimately it is our story as well. And our wrestling with God continues and happens all the time as we join together and are faithful in our search for new hope and new life. And so to the God who wrestles with us, to the God who calls us to new life, to that God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.